A map of modern China may remind you of the shape of a rooster, and it is the source of pride for many Chinese. But over the last 200 years, China's borders have shifted a number of times because of war, politics, and leadership changes. China's official size is almost 9.6 million square kilometers, but neighboring countries dispute Beijing's claims to some areas. Some of these territorial disagreements go back decades, even centuries. In the West, China and India both claim areas controlled by the other as their own. China says Arunachal Pradesh is actually part of southern Tibet, while India says Aksai Chin is part of Ladakh. In total, these disputed areas add up to 120,000 square kilometers of land. So how did this all start? The dispute dates back to at least 1914. Back then, representatives from British-ruled India and Tibet negotiated the Simla Convention. They agreed on a de facto border in the east, which they called the McMahon Line. New Delhi considers it the effective border between India and China, but Beijing has never agreed to recognize the line. In 1962, Chinese troops crossed the McMahon Line in the east and won a 4-week war against India. India says China then occupied about 43,000 square kilometers of its territory in the west, which China calls Aksai Chin. Despite warming relations over the years, the countries have never been able to agree on an official border. Instead, they reached a temporary truce along what is known as the Line of Actual Control. Still, conflict has erupted from time to time, with both armies accusing the other of breaches over the past 5 decades. Then, in mid-June of 2020, tensions boiled over. Chinese and Indian troops clashed with deadly consequences. Since both sides agreed in 1996 to ban firearms and explosives in the disputed region, the soldiers attacked each other with bare fists and clubs spiked with nails and wrapped in barbed wire. India says at least 20 of its soldiers were killed and 76 injured. China hasn't confirmed its casualties, but admitted its troops sustained minor injuries. Off China's east coast, there has been a long-running dispute over this archipelago, made up of 5 tiny islets and 3 barren rocks. China calls them the Diaoyu Islands, but Japan, which currently controls the area, calls them the Senkaku Islands. They're also not the only ones with a claim. The self-ruled island of Taiwan says the archipelago is part of its territory, and calls it the Diaoyutai. China controlled the islands until 1895, when Japan seized them at the end of the First Sino-Japanese War. After Japan's surrender to Allied forces at the end of World War II, under the Treaty of San Francisco, Tokyo returned most of the territory it seized from China, but these islands were left out of the agreement.
China now ending a war of more than 8 years.
Instead, the United States controlled them until 1972, when they were turned over to Japan along with Okinawa and other surrounding islands. Since then, regaining control of the archipelago has been a point of national pride for the Chinese. People from mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan have organized campaigns to sail in the waters near the islands. They've even tried to land on one to assert Chinese sovereignty. The situation intensified in 2012 after the Japanese government bought back 3 of the islands which had been sold to a family in 1932. Demonstrations spread across mainland China, with protesters targeting Japanese retail outlets and products. Thousands laid siege to the Japanese embassy in Beijing, throwing bottles and rocks. China then stepped up its presence in waters near the islands and set up an air defense identification zone that overlapped that of Japan's. Although relations between the countries have improved since then, the dispute over the island chain remains unresolved. China's territorial disputes with its neighbors are not just over islands and land. The country is embroiled in disputes with many of its Southeast Asian neighbors over the South China Sea. China claims nearly all of the sea as its territory, pointing to a 9-dash line that first appeared on Chinese maps in 1953. But the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Taiwan, and Malaysia also claim parts of these waters as their own. China has been criticized for developing military bases on islands and shoals in the disputed waters, while the United States has sought to counter China's influence by routinely sending naval vessels to the region on what it calls freedom of navigation exercises. Though the risk of conflict remains, throughout history China has shown that territorial disputes can be resolved through diplomacy. It regained control of Hong Kong from the British in 1997 and Macau from the Portuguese in 1999. It has also resolved disputes with Tajikistan, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Myanmar, and North Korea to either settle borders, regain territory, or jointly develop areas. But the recent violence on the disputed border with India, increasing military activity in South China Sea waters, and the island dispute with Japan underscore one major question. Can China's remaining territorial conflicts be resolved with words, or are they potential flashpoints for open confrontation?